So that was really something, wasn't it? I think for my idea of Batman and what I wanted to see from Gotham, this was my perfect Batman movie. Or almost, anyway. Now, when it comes to examining media, I never really enjoy doing straightforward reviews. Instead, I like to approach it with a certain framework in mind and criticise the media through that framework. This is where my In the Comics series comes from. For those of you that are new, In the Comics is a series where I take adaptations of comics, compare them to the source material, and see what they did the same, what each iteration did better, and what each iteration did differently just to service their respective stories but didn't affect the overall quality of the product. But in terms of adaptations, this really isn't one. Instead, this feels like a culmination of all that has come before with this character. And that is what is so amazing about comic book storytelling. These characters have changed hands so much that the characters evolve and are recontextualized in fascinating ways. And the best writers and artists are the ones that manage to evolve these characters but still keep them true to the core of who they really are. Does the Batman do that? It absolutely does. So the reason this is going to be an In the Comics episode is because while I was watching the movie, massive comic book addict that I am, I picked out several things that were either inspired by, nods to, or even lifted wholesale from other Batman works. But at the same time, it is still very much its own unique take on Batman and Gotham, because Gotham is the secondary protagonist, as she should be. So this isn't going to be a typical In the Comics episode. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take every Batman story or incarnation I feel this lifts from and discuss the movie through that framework. So first up we have... So aside from the openings of both stories taking place on Halloween, these iterations both place a very strong emphasis on the characteristics of Gotham. It's dark, it's filthy, it's corrupt, you never know what's around the next corner. Like Long Halloween, we see a Bruce that is fairly new to vigilantism, and the Batman is fairly new to Gotham, but these are not the really early days. He has been around long enough to know what he's doing, and the Batman is enough of a known presence that people know of and are terrified of him. This incorporates what I think a lot of Batman iterations are missing: the myth of the Batman. The moment this movie had me hooked was a few minutes in when the bat signal hits the sky, there are Gothamites committing crimes all over the city, and they suddenly turn towards the shadows as if he might be there. The whole reason Bruce is able to strike so much fear is because there is always that question in the back of the minds of criminals as to whether this guy is actually a man or not. And silly superstitions of criminals aside, you have to admit that in Gotham, that is a legitimate thing to be concerned about. It's just that narration when Bruce says, when that light hits the sky, it's not just a call, it's a warning. They think I'm in the shadows, but I am the shadows. That was the moment when I really thought, this movie just gets the myth of the Batman. Brilliant. One thing that is just completely taken from the Long Halloween is Carmine Falcone's connection to the Waynes. Carmine describes to Bruce how one night he was shot and brought to the Wayne estate to avoid hospitals, and Thomas Wayne, being a doctor, treated him. He even describes seeing Bruce sitting on the landing watching him. So yeah, that was a nice little nod to the Long Halloween. And the last thing I noticed, even though it was presented differently, was the changing times in Gotham. That was a big theme in the Long Halloween. The gangsters losing ground to the crazies. Organised crime being supplanted by anything but organised crime. The Riddler seems to be the start of this in Matt Reeves' iteration, especially since we see near the end him in Arkham having a conversation with who we presume is the Joker. This tells the audience that this change is coming if it's not already here. One other thing that was really important in The Long Halloween was the relationship between Batman Gordon and Harvey Dent. They're kind of like the trifecta of justice in that way. That, since Harvey Dent isn't a part of this movie, wasn't really present here, but I did see a lot of similarities between Batman and Gordon's relationship in this movie and Batman and Gordon's relationship in The Long Halloween. They both trust each other when no one else trusts Batman, and we see that trust get ever stronger throughout the movie. While The Long Halloween had a lot thematically and aesthetically in common with the Batman, the detective element of the story has much more in common with The Long Halloween's successor. The character journeys are not the same, as Bruce is in a very different emotional place in the movie than he is in Dark Victory, but the actual serial killer mystery bears a lot of resemblance to the Hangman killings. The Hangman leaves puzzle-like clues on the bodies of those whom they deem responsible for an evil committed upon them. Though the Hangman's motivation is an entirely personal revenge-based story, whereas the Riddler is more about retribution for systematic wrongs. But the similar modus operandi is worth taking note of. Though one particular distinction I would like to make is that Dark Victory is a mystery, whereas The Batman is a detective story. And the difference between the two would be the difference between, say, an Agatha Christie novel and Columbo. In a mystery, the seeds are carefully planted so the audience member or the reader can potentially work out who the killer is before even the detective does. Whereas a detective story, you may even be given the answer at the very beginning and you are just following the detective as they work it out. Now this may seem like a very small difference, but it does produce a very, very different viewer experience. So if you're going into this movie looking for a mystery, you're not really gonna get one. Telltale's Batman is one of the most underrated Batman stories ever, right up there with Dark Victory. For those who haven't played it, the villain Lady Arkham is going after corrupt people in Gotham, not only making them pay, but bringing to light their misdeeds to the Gotham public. Where there was a lot to be taken from the MO of the Hangman Killer in Dark Victory, Lady Arkham's motivation has a lot more in common with the Riddler in this movie, especially since this corruption, aside from just being wrong, put both killers on the path towards a life of misery and even mental instability. But the big similarity is Bruce finding out that his father was involved with the mob. However, this was severely toned down in the movie, to its detriment in my personal opinion. In Telltale's, the Waynes were fully ingrained in the corruption of Gotham. Thomas Wayne sentenced Oswald Cobblepot's mother to Arkham when she wouldn't cooperate. And this isn't the only instance of them doing something like this either. The Waynes were terrible people. This portrayal of Thomas Wayne also seems to have been used for the Joker. But in The Batman, this is put down by Alfred saying that Thomas was just desperate, that this journalist was writing terrible articles about Martha and he just wanted him to stop, so he innocently went to a mobster and asked him to take care of it and was so shocked when the journalist turned up dead and was so broken up about it that he was going to hand himself in just before he was killed. That felt like such a cop-out to me. But again, that may just be personal. Though there is always the chance that Alfred is lying to protect Bruce, because who takes their wife and son out to the pictures the night before they turn them into police after they have told the mobster they asked help from that they were going to do just that? So yeah, either Thomas Wayne is lobotomized levels of stupid or Alfred is a liar! I saw a lot of similarities in the emotional places Bruce seems to be in both these works. I get definite angry young man vibes from both of them, though this Bruce seems a little bit better at controlling his temper. Both of them certainly seem more comfortable with going out into the cesspool of a city and taking their anger out on criminals than sitting down and having a meal with the men who raised them. This seems to shift after Alfred is injured due to his connection with Bruce, and the young man realizes in that moment that he may not be afraid of dying or anything that may happen to him out there, but losing someone else he loves will break him. And he and Alfred seem to at least bridge some of that gap between them. Another small thing in common is Alfred's guilt over how Bruce has turned out. But in Origins, he is the standard, kind, fatherly, ever-steady presence I think most people associate with Alfred, myself included. So he seems to have done the best anyone could, and it's mostly just Bruce's issues. In the movie, though, Alfred outright says that he was not prepared to raise a child, let alone a traumatized one. He could teach him how to fight, but the emotional support the boy needed wasn't something Alfred was prepared to give. So it seems like Alfred does bear some responsibility here, and while it's not my personal view of Alfred, it's definitely very interesting. Because you ask yourself, how did someone with this much wealth, access to help, and a loving guardian end up this damaged? I saw some articles online that claimed Matt Reeves said he took some inspiration for this Batman from the comic Batman Ego. And that kind of threw me a little bit because the duality between Bruce Wayne and Batman is not something that is present in this movie. And that comic was all about the dual nature of the character. They literally split him into id and ego. I guess I can see that this is a version of the character that is all id and no ego. And I'm sure Matt Reeves did take inspiration from it, but it's not a comparison I would have ever made unless it was outright stated to me. But I did want to include it because it was apparently confirmed by Reeves himself. And I also wanted to talk about it because I've seen on the online discourse that a lot of people are taking issue with the lack of duality in this movie. But I don't see this as something that's really a problem because there are so many aspects to Batman's character, personality, and world that are ripe for exploring. One thing a lot of people seem to think is essential is the Batman creating his villains theme, and while I do love that theme, I don't necessarily think you have to include it, because there are so many other things to explore. The Gotham TV show gets away with this fine because it's more focused on the city and the villains than Bruce, even though he is a main character. Just as a side note, I'm not really interested in this whole GCPD spin-off series. Just watch Gotham. I know it's trash, but it's my trash. It's like a cat you find digging through your bins. It's messy, it's ill-behaved, it never does what you want, but oh boy does it have character and you can't help but love it. Sorry. Back to the issue. While this film takes place in Year 2, it has a lot more in common with the comic Year 1, though this is thankfully not an origin story. This is a Gotham that knows Batman well enough and little enough to be scared of him. He's green enough that we see him go through a journey, but we don't need to know exactly where that journey started, and that is perfect. Although the story and characters do have quite a bit in common with the Year 1 comic, it bears pretty much no resemblance to Year 2. One particular thing is Selina and the very obvious wealth difference between her and Bruce. In the movie, she outright states to Batman, while they're having a conversation about criminals and criminal responsibility, she says, "Whoever you are under that mask, you definitely grew up with money." And it's through her that Bruce kinda starts to see that criminals don't just wake up one morning and say, "I'm gonna be a criminal, that'll be fun." Does that mean their actions are excusable? Of course not. But there is a level of understanding you have to have if you're going to tackle the issue of criminality. You have to know why it happens. You can't just punch the problem and have it go away. And also, Selina's relationship with Falcone is present here as well. That was set up in year one and then fully realised in Long Halloween, as Long Halloween is a continuation of year one. Whereas it was left ambiguous in the comics, it is confirmed here. Falcone says it himself. And in these iterations, this is where Selina is the one who gives him the 3 scars across his face. One little thing I noticed, and I don't know if this is a direct homage or just a coincidence, but the image of Bruce just walking through the city with his coat bundled around him and his hood up, just the image of isolation despite being surrounded by people. And this brings up a really interesting question as to this character being so universally known that if 2 writers never speak and never see each other's work, could they potentially come up with exactly the same idea? Another iteration I think this Batman had in common personality-wise with was The Dark Knight. Although this is the point before Frank Miller forgot that Batman being fascist was supposed to be a bad thing. The movie and the Batman of this comic seem to have a very similar way of looking at the world, but I think Matt Reeves' Batman is kind of a reverse Dark Knight. The Dark Knight seems to have once been a hopeful vigilante who thought he could change things, but after just going through it night after night and seeing nothing change, he is kind of emotionally given up, but his body is still going through the motions and still going through autopilot because he doesn't know how to do anything else. And his experiences of crime fighting have made him significantly harsher than he used to be. Whereas in the movie, this seems to be a Batman who is currently in that frame of mind, but we see a distinctly hopeful turn in the character through his experiences. So that's what I mean by this kind of being a reverse Dark Knight. And we see this at the ending when he carries that girl in his arms towards the stretcher and she grabs him because she doesn't want him to let her go because he is genuinely her hero and she feels safe with him. And that is the point in the movie where I think Bruce realizes what he's been missing from this whole vigilante thing. This is when he starts seeing the value of saving the innocent rather than punishing the guilty. And that is why I see this as my perfect Batman film. It's dark, it's brutal, it's exhausting, but it still has that hopeful edge to it. And I personally see Batman as one of the most deceptively hopeful characters in all of comics. To do what he does consistently, you kind of have to be. There isn't much here, but they do mention Elliot as a journalist Thomas Wayne accidentally got killed. Seriously, you ask a gangster to take care of a problem for you and you didn't know what was going to happen? So yeah, either Alfred is lying or this is a case of the writer really stretching reality here. This doesn't say much, but it does leave the door open for a potential Hush adaptation, which I'm cautious about considering just how much of a mess that comic is. But I think as long as Matt Reeves just picks the interesting bits and constructs his own story around them, as he did with this movie, it could potentially be very interesting. And on that note, I would like to close this off by giving my comments on what Reeves stated he would be interested in doing with this as a potential trilogy. As I said, I am cautiously optimistic for a Hush adaptation since I do believe this is a director who could make it genuinely good, as that hasn't been done yet. Even the original comic was not good. Reeves has also stated that he's interested in the Court of Owls, and while I have voiced my objections to them in the past, see this video and go to this timestamp for more information, I do think in a self-contained story it could potentially work. My main objection to them as a villain is that secret societies that have all the fingers in all the pies ruin stories that aren't completely self-contained. If you want to do more, they are constantly hovering in the background with If they're all seeing and all knowing, then they gotta be seeing this, they gotta be having opinions about it. What are they doing about it? But if this is just a trilogy, it could work if it is carefully managed. And lastly, Reeves said he is interested in including Robin, and yes, give me Dick, I want that! I'm not apologising. However, one thing I really hope they don't do is age him up. He has to be a young kid. And I think there are two distinct objections to this. One is the age-old argument that Batman works better as a lone wolf, and while I do respect the lone detective angle, as I think it is an appropriate direction to take the character, I am with Jeff Loeb in the idea that Robin is essential. I covered this in my Dark Victory review, but he does work. And I am with you in the sense that this shouldn't be all light and classic comic booky, and I think a lot of people are under the impression that adding a child will inevitably turn it into that. But no. Adding a child, if done right, has the potential to make it even darker. Not to mention all the interesting psychological and emotional things you can do by throwing a child into the mix. Dick is part of what brings Bruce into a better frame of mind. He will never fully get away from what happened to him, and he shouldn't. But adding Dick Grayson adds another side to Batman's character, and also their relationship is ripe with potential for both touching and seriously dysfunctional storytelling. Reeves' work on Let Me In shows that you can make something dark out of childhood innocence, and if he approaches this character in the same way he did that movie, I think we could have an amazing Robin on our hands. Robin does fit into this horrendous noir hellscape, precisely because in a perfect world, he shouldn't fit in it. And Batman is fighting for a world where no little boy has to go through what he did. He wasn't able to stop Dick's parents from dying, but he can stop him from becoming another broken Batman.
Robin needed to help bring the men who murdered his family to justice.
So he could turn out like you?
So that he wouldn't.
So yeah, if it's approached from this angle, I am dying to see what Reeves could do with Robin. As long as he is a child, if you make him a teenager, it changes the entire dynamic and dilutes the concept. Please don't age him up. And the second objection is the whole child acting objection. And I know genuinely talented child actors are rare, but they exist. I think recently Hollywood has started to realise that you don't have to either age the character up or settle for substandard child acting. I mean, look at Daphne Keane. Did you know 11-year-olds could do this? Just do what they did in Logan. Find the talent, do some creative stunt work, and you're golden. So there you have it. That was my messy comic book review / comparison of The Batman. We waited so long for this movie and it did not disappoint. I am very optimistic for this character's future. I don't know how so many talented directors are able to keep finding new angles from which to approach this character, but I think it is the simple baseline premise that opens the door for so many different emotional and psychological explorations with him. And I cannot wait to see what comes next.